In this video, I will do an overview of the history of the major parties in America. Initially, I was planning a short one-off video, but as I prepared this, I really got into it, and there's a lot of material I would like to share, and it will end up being two parts. I will go into the history of the different periods of American history, the issues that shaped each era, and the political figures that played prominently in each party. Although my intention is to focus on ideas, it is important to remember that not every American, or every politician for that matter, was focused on ideas. Many belong to a particular political party due to a social, familial, or localized reason, and not always because of the kinds of ideas I will be talking about in this video. But that being said, I do think ideas are important. And while it may seem as though our major political parties fall down on ideas rather randomly, there is a certain logic to it, and there has been throughout a history a certain lineage of how those parties fell on different issues, and I hope to make that clear as I proceed with this video. So let's take a look at how these parties formed. Let's first go back to the founding of the United States. It was not inevitable that this would be a united country. It could have been separate smaller countries like what you might find in Central America or the Caribbean, or it could have been something like a looser coalition of semi-independent countries like you would find today in the EU. Indeed, these colonies operated mostly separately before the American Revolution. They were united somewhat because they were all British colonies, but they were largely governed separately with separate economies and were developing separate cultures. After the American Revolution, those separate identities remained. The expectations of many were that they would go on operating, with each state being mostly independent of each other. So they created this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which governed the country in its initial years with a central government that had very limited powers. After the American Revolution, this is what we had, but many believe that this was not the right approach. Could a more powerful central government allow for a stronger defense, more stable finances, and a stronger economy? Could pooled resources allow the new states to tackle problems more effectively than mostly separate states could fending for themselves? The first two factions or kind of proto parties that existed in the United States broke down on these questions. Federalists, as they would come to be called, wanted a stronger federal government. Anti-federalists were against that. So that debate would sometimes revolve around whether or not they should amend the Articles of Confederation to strengthen the federal government, but increasingly the talk moved to creating a new system altogether. So Federalists during this period would include Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. The Anti-Federalist would include George Clinton and Patrick Henry. So representatives from each state would meet in Philadelphia. Initially, the stated purpose for this meeting was to amend the Articles of Confederation, but they would eventually write a new constitution. And it would need to be ratified by referendums in each state, with at least 9 of them voting yes on that referendum. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay would write the Federalist Papers, which would advocate for a yes vote, but others, like George Clinton, would advocate for a no vote. Within the Federalist faction, there were sub-factions. Hamilton probably wanted a constitution that had a more powerful central government and a more powerful executive, but he held his nose and agreed to some of the compromises that would limit central and executive power because he figured that what they would end up writing with this constitution would be an improvement over the Articles of Confederation, and compromise was needed to get enough yes votes from the people who were moderate or on the fence on these questions. So the Constitution gets ratified and George Washington becomes president. Initially, he didn't want there to be parties, as he wanted everybody to work towards consensus. And his cabinet was ideologically diverse, especially in his first term. But by his second term, factions would indeed emerge into kind of proto parties, despite Washington's wishes that things be otherwise. The leaders of these two factions had both been in Washington's cabinet in his first term. One was Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, mentioned earlier, and the other was Washington's Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson may have been an anti-federalist before, but we don't know because he was in France during the Constitutional Convention and the referendums that followed. Both Jefferson and Hamilton were thinkers. They were ideologues, and they believed strongly in their respective broad visions. Not every politician at the time was like that, though, and that's important to wrap our heads around as we start to look at how these early parties formed. So we're going to to look at the ideas of these two men, as I think the first two parties largely stemmed from their ideas. And I think that that will help us to understand the kind of first political parties that developed. So Hamilton's party would come to be called the Federalist Party, and Jefferson's party were called Republicans at first, and then Democratic Republicans later on. So to avoid confusion and to differentiate this party from the later Republican Party, I'm going to be mostly referring to them as Democratic Republicans for the sake of this discussion. So let's first look at the Federalist and the ideas of Alexander Hamilton and what he thought the future of the country should be. So he very much was pro industrialization and urbanization. He was for commerce and was generally a supporter of the business community. And in order for that to materialize, he favored a strong central government and a national bank. That he hoped that the national bank would stabilize the currency and stabilize the economy more generally. And he also believed in higher tariffs, and he wanted to achieve two things with these high tariffs. First, it would be a kind of protection for these new industries that he hoped would emerge to keep competition from foreign manufacturers from being too robust. He wanted people to have to pay more to buy from foreign manufacturers than they would from domestic manufacturers. And he also hoped that the tariffs would provide revenue to fund various internal improvements. Internal improvements like improving the ports, perhaps building canals and other turnpikes and improved roadways and waterways that could help with these commercial interests that he had. And he favored a strong executive, in other words, a powerful president. Besides Hamilton, some prominent other Federalists would include John Adams, and he would be Washington's vice president and then the second president of the United States. The aforementioned John Jay will be an ambassador, a diplomat, a secretary of state, a governor of New York, and a Supreme Court justice. I often feel like John Jay doesn't get as much press in the modern times, modern history, as some of these other founding fathers, but I think Jay was certainly very important to the early United States history. So Adams was from Massachusetts and Jay was from New York. In South Carolina, the Pinckney family would be prominent Federalists. So Thomas Pinckney would be a representative in Congress, a governor of South Carolina, and a sort of running mate to John Adams in 1796. And his brother, Charles Cotworth Pinckney, pictured on the right, ran as Adams' running mate in 1800 and ran himself in 1804 as the presidential candidate that year. So switching gears, let's take a look at the Democratic Republicans. Remember, this would be the party of Thomas Jefferson, and I think that what they saw as the vision of the America's future would be a country where with an economy based on small farms and small farmers, kind of rural communities. Think Little House on the Prairie. I think that that ideal that show encapsulated would have been the kind of thing that Democratic Republicans would have thought was a good way for America to be. So they tended to favor states' rights. Many of them had been anti-federalists during the original referendum on the Constitution, but not all. Some were federalists, but kind of lukewarm federalists that maybe didn't like the Articles of Confederation, but also didn't want to go too far in the direction of strong central power. So they tended to favor, like I said, states' rights. They were not for the national bank. They were against that idea, and they were for lower tariffs. So if they were a party largely of small farmers, they would have favored lower tariffs because farmers would have needed to buy certain manufactured goods and they would have wanted them to have access to those cheaper goods. They were not necessarily so interested in building industries as the Federalists had been. Now, foreign policy is going to be important as well during this period. Remember, this is the period of the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars. So the wars between Britain and France would kind of dominate world affairs. And the Democratic Republicans tended to be more pro-France and more anti-British. And I think that had something to do with Thomas Jefferson himself being something of a Francophile, and he kind of liked the ideas of the French Revolution and, favored those more than the Federalists did. And I think the Democratic Republicans would also tend to favor stronger individual rights than the Federalists would. So much of the time, the earlier Federalist anti Federalist division would line up with this new Federalist Democratic Republican division. It did in the case of Hamilton and George Clinton, pictured on the left there. Clinton had been governor of New York and would be Jefferson's running mate in 1804. But sometimes it didn't always go with the same divisions. In the case of Patrick Henry, who I mentioned earlier as being an anti-federalist when the Constitution was first being discussed and ratified, he's going to become a federalist during this period of the early republic. And James Madison, who had been a staunch supporter of the Constitution and been considered a federalist during the writing and ratifying of the Constitution, he's going to become a Democratic Republican during this period, joining his fellow Virginian Thomas Jefferson and supporting much of his policy agenda in the early 1800s. Another important Democratic Republican will be James Monroe, pictured here, who's also going to be a Virginian and an ally of Thomas Jefferson during this early period of the Republic. So after the 1796 election, John Adams is going to become the second president, and he's going to pass some controversial measures, and that's going to cause things to really come to a head between these two parties and things are going to start to get really contentious. So the Federalists are going to pass these acts called the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the sedition part is going to clamp down on free speech and target speech that will go against the administration. The alien part of the Alien and Sedition Acts is going to restrict what immigrants can do as they engage in political activity. And those immigrants are often going to be allied with Jefferson. So they're going to be seen as very politicized acts, and the Jeffersonians are going to oppose them vehemently. And Jefferson, in fact, is going to encourage states that support him to nullify these acts and not enforce them. So this nullification effort is going to be referred to as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, as those were the two states that passed these nullification resolutions. So Jefferson is going to run against Adams in 1800 in that election, and he's going to pick Aaron Burr as his running mate that year, Aaron Burr being from New York. So at the time, the rules for how the president and vice president were determined were different than what they would be later on and what they are now. So at this time, basically, each elector in the Electoral College gets 2 votes, and at the end of the day, the person who gets first place will be president, the person who gets second place will be vice president. And remember, the original idea was that there wouldn't be parties, that there wouldn't be factions. So the thought was that these electors would all vote differently, and then they would tally the votes, and then it would go, there'd be one person getting first place, one person getting the second place. But what ended up happening is that you had these 2 camps, and each elector belonged to one of those different camps. So it tended to be that everybody that voted Federalist for one of their votes would vote Federalist in the other, and also that way for the Democratic Republicans. So what would end up happening is everybody that voted for Jefferson also voted for Burr, making it essentially a tie between Jefferson and Burr. Now, the Federalists also ran Adams in this election for re-election, and his running mate was Charles Pinckney, as I mentioned earlier. Now, they figured this out, and they actually had one elector vote for John Jay, but it didn't matter because all the Federalists kind of trailed Jefferson and Burr, but because there was a tie between the two, it ended up going to the House of Representatives to determine who the next president would be. And Burr was one of these people who was not necessarily an ideological Jeffersonian. He belonged to that party nominally, but once it came time for this situation, he thought that he might have a chance to become president if he allied with the Federalists, and he tried to strike a deal with those Federalists. Now, meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton was on the sidelines, and he had had a falling out with John Adams. While they both were in the same party and believed mostly in the same things, their personal differences would become too much for them to bear, and Hamilton would kind of withdraw his support for Adams. At first, he would urge the electors to vote for Pinckney, but when Pinckney didn't end up getting enough support, it ended up becoming a battle between Jefferson and Burr. And even though Hamilton disagreed with Jefferson ideologically, they differed on many issues, Hamilton just did not like Aaron Burr, and what he would end up doing is urging his supporters to actually support Jefferson in the end. After the Federalists will lose in the election of 1800, their popularity is going to decline, but they're still going to be a factor and still be a major part of politics, at least for a little while. But then things are going to really start to decline further for them in the 1810s. So in the 1812 election, the Federalists are actually going to nominate DeWitt Clinton, who was the nephew of George Clinton, who had been a Democratic Republican, but DeWitt Clinton is going to agree with the Federalists on many of their ideas, including the need for internal improvements. So he's going to run under their banner, but lose rather decisively to Madison. Then the War of 1812 is going to break out. The Federalists are going to largely take an anti war position. Many of the Federalists are going to be from New England. That was kind of where their stronghold was. And the New England economy is going to be tied to Canada and Britain. So they're going to be rather squeamish about the war, and that's going to cause them to lose popularity elsewhere in the country. So after the war ends, the Federalists will really not any longer be much of a factor in American politics. However, their ideas are still going to continue to, have a lot of traction. In fact, gain some traction, because I think one of the things that happens as a result of the war is a lot of Americans are going to come to realize the importance of having good infrastructure and how lacking America's infrastructure was during the war. So there's the popularity of internal improvements is really going to gain traction after the war ends. And DeWitt Clinton is going to become the governor of New York, and he's going to lead the effort to build the Erie Canal, which is going to be the major infrastructure project, the major internal improvement. It's going to connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie, and in so doing, really connect the Atlantic Ocean to the interior of the United States. So that's going to be a major difference in the American economy moving forward after that. But we're going to have a period where the United States is really going to only have one major party. So during the presidency of James Monroe, he's going to follow Madison. He's really not going to have much opposition at all as he runs for his two different terms. And his Secretary of State is going to be John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, the former Federalist president. And John Quincy Adams is really going to more or less be on the same page with his father on the issues. He's going to start off as a Federalist, but during this period where the Federalist Party is really not much to speak of, he's going to join the Democratic Republicans briefly and decide to work with them. John Quincy Adams himself is going to be president following James Monroe. So Quincy Adams will be the sixth president, winning a contentious election against Andrew Jackson. Now, in 1824, Andrew Jackson is going to win the plurality of the popular vote and the Electoral College, but not win a majority of either, as it was a four-person race. And when that happens, the House of Representatives ends up deciding, and the House ends up giving the presidency to John Quincy Adams. Then in 1828, John Quincy Adams runs for re-election, and Andrew Jackson challenges him to a rematch. This time, Andrew Jackson's going to win. And Jackson will favor more executive power than his Democratic Republican predecessors, but otherwise, he's going to largely support a lot of those Democratic Republican ideas, like he's going to be against the banks, against internal improvements, and Jackson's going to favor low tariffs. Now, generally, he's going to be for states' rights, but he's not going to go so far as to favor nullification, which the Jeffersonians had supported nullification with their Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. During Jackson's era, there's going to be an effort by South Carolina to nullify a tariff rule. And even though Andrew Jackson didn't particularly agree with tariffs, he also did not agree with nullification. And he's actually going to put down that effort by South Carolina to nullify a federal law. Jackson's also going to favor a robust spoil system. So when he comes in, he's going to get rid of a lot of Adams's bureaucrats. Now, that happens to agree most of the time, but Jackson's going to do it more than normal. And he's going to replace these bureaucrats that Adams had hired with some of his own Jacksonian loyalists. So he's also going to support something called the Indian Removal Act, which is going to relocate many Indians from southeastern states to reservations in Oklahoma. So this is going to open land up to people seeking additional farmland. And I think this is an important point worth mentioning. Remember, the Democratic Republicans had favored the small farmers. Now, what do you know about small farmers? They tend to have large families. Now, over the course of several generations, when you have large families that then have large families and then have large families, you're going to have an increase in population. And when you have a population that's based on farming, they're going to need more land. As you get more people, more land is going to be needed if everybody is a farmer and there's only so much farmland. So there's always going to be this need to find more farmland under this Democratic Republican way of operating. And one of the ways to do that is to take over Indian lands. So So they're going to do that. They're going to remove these Indians, but it's going to face a lot of opposition from a lot of these anti-Jacksonians, which is going to eventually coalesce around a new party. And many of those folks would be the same folks who had supported John Quincy Adams when he went against Andrew Jackson. So Jackson's going to be something of a polarizing figure, and he's going to have his share of supporters, but he's also going to have his share of opponents. Something that's going to start to grow in prominence are urban political machines. And in the 1820s and 1830s, the cities are starting to grow, but not to the degree that they will in the decades that follow. But these political machines will get off to a head start, starting to organize people, and particularly by organizing the poor and the immigrants. And they're going to be largely, especially in the big cities, allied with the Democratic Party. So that's going to give the Democratic Party an edge with immigrants and with urban voters that they're really never going to lose. They're going to continue to have that edge really to this day. And the most prominent of these urban political machines is going to be Tammany Hall in New York City. And basically, they're going to be organizing these folks, operating a kind of patronage system, giving out jobs and other incentives to them, and then helping them to politically do their bidding as far as their votes go. So in that Jacksonian period, we're going to see emerge a new party called the Whig Party. And the Whigs, first and foremost, are going to be the anti-Jacksonian party. And they take their name from the British version of the Whigs, which is this sort of opposition party. They would try to portray Andrew Jackson as a king. They referred to him as King Andrew because, he favored a large executive power, and he favored the spoils system. So the Whigs Party is going to emerge, and they're going to be a pretty big tent and have a lot of different factions. But what I'm going to focus on as I focus on these ideas is the kind of mainline Whigs, the ideas that most of them shared, although we're going to see the faction that didn't share these views is going to end up playing a big part, but we'll get to that. So the general Whig platform is going to include higher tariffs, both for the sake of protection of American industries as well as to generate revenue. So they're going to want to use that revenue for internal improvements, much like the Federalists. So the Whigs are going to take on many of those same Federalist ideas. They're also going to be proponents of the national bank, and they're going to want to use government to help promote commerce and commercial interests as well as helping industry. Now the Whigs between the two parties are going to be a little bit more skeptical of immigrants, and they're going to be for more restrictions on immigration than the Democrats will be. The Democrats are going to be organizing those immigrant groups, as I mentioned earlier. And by the way, more and more the Democratic Republicans are going to start to be referred to as Democrats here. You're starting to see me shift in that terminology, and that's generally how historians tend to use the term Democrat more and more as we move into these 1830s. So the Whigs are also going to favor stronger Congress and a weaker executive. So that's going to make them a little bit different than the Federalists. And I would say in general, there's going to be a lot of reform movements that are going to happen during this time, including the temperance movement, including the anti-slavery movement. There's going to be a few others. There's going to be a movement towards prison reform, towards more expanding public education. And it's going to be the Whigs that are going to tend to hold those views more than the Democrats will. So let's take a look at some of these prominent Whigs from this time period, starting with John Quincy Adams, who kind of started it all. And he had been cooperative with the Democratic Republican Party, but I don't think his heart was ever really with the Jacksonians or even with James Monroe for that matter. So he's going to be a prominent Whig when this new party forms. Now, this is going to be one of the few times where a former president is going to stay very active in politics. In fact, he's going to run for a House seat and be a member of Congress for a good number of years after his presidency. So as a member of Congress, he's going to represent Massachusetts as a member of this Whig party. Another Massachusetts Whig is going to be Daniel Webster, another prominent person in both the Congress, as he's going to be in the House and the Senate. He's also going to serve as Secretary of State, so he's going to be a major figure, and he's going to favor the internal improvements. He's going to favor the higher tariff, and he's also going to be a proponent of the national bank. Another prominent Whig during this time will be Henry Clay, and Henry Clay will be, certainly regarded as one of the more philosophical leaders of the Whig Party. He's going to be pushing their agenda for a lot of the time in Congress. He's also going to be a presidential candidate on two different occasions. So Henry Henry Clay is going to advocate for a national bank. He's going to also advocate for a higher tariff and for internal improvements. And then the other person we see pictured here is William Seward, who's going to be another prominent Whig during this time. And he's from New York. He's going to serve as both governor and senator. Maybe the one thing that where he might have been a little bit out of line with the mainline Whigs, Seward's going to be more pro-immigration than the average Whig will be. And that may have been a factor that could have kept him from ever being nominated as the presidential candidate, as I think a lot of the mainline Whigs were kind of skeptical of his more pro-immigrant views. But still, Seward is going to be an important person in his own right. It's certainly on the issue of the extension of slavery into Kansas. He's going to really lead that effort to try to keep Kansas from being a slave state. Territorial expansion is going to be an important issue during this time. Remember what I was saying earlier about the Democratic Republicans and then later the Democrats being a party of small farmers. The populations of small farmers were always growing as they were always having large families, and that was part of the issue with the Indian Removal Act. But it's also going to be a key issue when we start talking about westward expansion, because they're going to run out of land in the east and look for more land to use for farming. And the Southwest was an area that they were looking to expand. Now, at the beginning of this period, a lot of those southwestern territories were actually controlled by Mexico as part of the Mexican territory, actually first controlled by Spain, and then later when Mexico got independent from Spain, it was Mexican territory. So the idea of first annexing Texas and then spreading the United States territory westward past Texas was something that many Democrats favored, but something that the Whigs were rather hesitant about. The Whigs tended to be much more dovish regarding their policies towards Mexico and territorial expansion, and the Democrats tended to be more hawkish and for territorial expansion. Andrew Jackson is going to have two different vice presidents in his two terms. In his first term, John C. Calhoun is going to be his vice president, but he's going to have a disagreement with Calhoun over the handling of South Carolina and that nullification issue that I mentioned earlier. So John C. Calhoun is going to leave the team, and for Andrew Jackson's second term, Martin Van Buren is going to be his vice president. Martin Van Buren of New York is going to be much more of a right-hand man for Andrew Jackson and going to be more supportive of him. And then in 1836, Van Buren is going to run in his own right and win election as president himself in 1836. But the economy is going to really tank during Martin Van Buren's term, so 1840 is going to be a very difficult election for him. Now, in 1836, it was really the first election where the Whigs really ran candidates on their own, but they didn't run one candidate. They ran different candidates in different regions, so it wasn't really a proper, candidacy. But in 1840, they are going to run William Henry Harrison as their candidate. Now, Harrison didn't have a ton of political experience. He hadn't had elected office, so we couldn't really see a voting record for him or any kind of governing record. But he had been a popular general in the War of 1812, and having a popular general run is something that definitely helped the Whigs. And Harrison took on something of at least a populist themed kind of election campaign. It's interesting because probably Van Buren had a more humble upbringing than Harrison did, but Harrison sort of implied that he grew up in a log cabin and, was, trying to connect with sort of the average voter. The Democrats before this had really been the populist party, the party of the common farmer, and Harrison didn't want to cede a lot of those votes and wanted to try to appeal to those, common voters as well. So William Henry Harrison, with that message and with the help of the bad economy, is going to actually beat Martin Van Buren in that election. Now, a little show and tell here in the picture. You're going to see this little flyer here. I actually visited the Martin Van Buren homestead recently, and they were giving these away, as this would have been given away during the 1840 election. And on the side panels there, it has the different views or the different policy positions, the different planks in the platform of the Democrats at the time. And it's going to list a lot of the stuff that we talked about. It's going to have a strong focus on states' rights. It's going to mention even states' rights on the issue of slavery. It's going to talk about being against the national bank, against internal improvements, and for low tariffs. It's also going to talk about being a little bit more friendly towards immigrants, having a little bit looser immigration policy also as part of the platform. And in the middle of the panel, it had all the different candidates that the Democrats were running at the time, not just the presidency, but the different congressional offices, the different state offices, even the local offices like the coroner, the county coroner, and the town clerk were on the lists here. I don't know if all these different candidates all believed in every item on the platform. They probably didn't, but it I think it is interesting that they were putting their platform there in writing to spell out for voters to see. So Harrison would be the first president to die in office. So it wasn't something that America really had any experience with during this time. So what's going to happen now that the president is dead? What's going to, who's going to take over? Who's going to be in charge? Now, I think that people didn't necessarily know what Harrison was going to do as president, what his policies would be. He was a member of the Whig Party, but he didn't have much of a voting record that people could point to. Now, interesting, Harrison would be from a Whig party. His grandson is going to be a president, and a lot of the policies that his grandson is going to favor are going to be a lot of the mainline Whig positions, things like the tariff and internal improvements, etc. But what happens when a president dies is not that people build a time machine and bring the president's grandson back in time to serve as president. What instead happens is the vice president takes over. Now, remember what I said earlier about the Whig Party being an anti-Jackson party, and a lot of people opposed Jackson for different reasons. Now, Tyler came from an entirely different faction than the mainline Whigs, so he did not have the same policy positions as the likes of Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and William Seward and John Quincy Adams. In fact, the reason why Tyler was against Jackson had a lot to do with nullification and South Carolina. He basically felt that Jackson was not states' rights enough, that Tyler was even more of a Jeffersonian than Jackson. So you couldn't get anything further from the mainline Whigs than John Tyler. But John Tyler is going to be the president representing the Whigs, and really the first president to serve more than 1 month as a Whig Party member. So he's not going to get the party off to a good start, or at least not a start where he's going to be pushing for the Whig agenda. In fact, he's going to get in the way of the Whig agenda, vetoing a lot of the bills that are going to be supported by the likes of Henry Clay. So the Whigs are going to pretty much disown John Tyler, and they're going to go to the voters and say, never mind about the Tyler presidency. We want to start over again with a different candidate. So in 1844, Henry Clay is going to be the nominee, and he's going to be more of a card-carrying Whig, supporting the mainline Whig agenda. And he's going to be going against the Democrats' James Polk. Now, after the almost 4 years of John Tyler and the Whig opposition to him, it's going to be really hard to sell another Whig to the voters. Although Henry Clay is not going to do too bad. As you can see on the map here, Henry Clay does win a good handful of states, but he's not going to win enough states, enough electoral votes to get the presidency. James Polk is instead going to be the president, and Polk is definitely going to be a hawk on the issue of Texas and Mexico. So Texas is going to get annexed. So you see in the 1848 map, you're going to see Texas now a state, and you're going to see the Mexican territory now become part of the United States territory as the war with Mexico is going to be waged. The Whigs are going to be largely against it, with a lot of the Whigs that we talked about earlier voting against it, but James Polk is going to be for it. They're going to win and end up extending the American territory throughout the Southwest towards the Pacific Ocean. So in the 1848 election, however, we are going to see the Whigs make a comeback here as they're going to nominate another general. They're going to nominate Zachary Taylor. And perhaps they felt like with their dovish position on the Mexican War, they needed a general to sort of shore up enough support to win. So Taylor is going to end up winning the presidency, and Lewis Cass is going to be the Democratic nominee. And I think what happens here is the Democrats are going to split. Martin Van Buren is going to actually run in 1848, not as a Democrat, but as a member of the Free Soil Party. And Martin Van Buren's vote total in New York is going to be higher than Lewis Cass's. So if we were to assume that if Van Buren wasn't in the race, him being a Democrat, that his voters would have gone towards Cass, then that would have given Cass New York, and with New York, Cass could have won the presidency. But because the Democrat vote was split in New York, it ended up going to Taylor, and that allowed Taylor to win in 1848, serving as another Whig president, another former general, and this time a general from Louisiana. So Zachary Taylor is going to win the presidential election in 1848, but he too is going to die in office. So another Whig general elected president, another one dies in office. So his vice president, Millard Fillmore, is going to take over and become president. Now, during this period, now we're starting to get into the early 1850s, and slavery is going to become a bigger and bigger issue during this period, and it's going to divide both parties. Fillmore is going to try to have a more centrist position. He is a northern politician. He's from New York State, but he's going to try to enact policies that will, keep the South appeased and not to upset them too much, which would, in fact, anger a lot of Whigs in the North who are going to be becoming more and more against slavery. So something will come to be during this period called the Compromise of 1850, and that's going to have a number of different provisions that are meant to alleviate some of the tension that's going to be brewing between the North and the South, between the slave states and the free states. So the Compromise of 1850 is going to be put together by the Whig Henry Clay and the Democrat Stephen Douglas. And here are going to be some of these provisions. It's going to admit California as a free state, and it's also going to enforce something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which is going to require citizens of northern states to return any slaves that run away into the North. It's also going to allow slavery in the New Mexico territory, and then have this thing called popular sovereignty, which is basically going to be referendums when these territories do eventually become states. They're going to have referendums to determine whether or not they'll be slave states or free states. Now, many in the North are going to not want slavery to extend into these southwestern states / territories. So there's going to be a lot in the North that are going to oppose these ideas, including William Seward, including John Fremont, and many others. So it's going to be an extremely divisive issue, but Millard Fillmore, who's going to be president at this time, is going to support this Compromise of 1850, angering a lot of other Whigs and Northerners in general. So the 1852 election is going to be something of a last hurrah for the Whigs, the last election where they are going to be an active party. They're going to consider renominating Fillmore, but end up deciding against it, as Fillmore's popularity really kind of declines during this time, as no faction really seems to strongly support his ideas. They're going to consider nominating Daniel Webster, a more of a card-carrying member of the Whig Party, but they're going to end up not doing so. Instead, they're going to go to that well one more time. They had nominated two generals who had won their respective elections, so why not go with another popular general? So they're going to nominate Winfield Scott in 1852 as their nominee. And they're going to be in disarray, and Winfield Scott's only going to end up winning 4 states. The Democrat Franklin Pierce is going to win in something of an electoral college landslide. But unfortunately for Pierce, tragedy is really going to strike him, as his son is going to die in a horrific accident. A train is going to tip over, and he will end up passing away. And that's going to leave Pierce in a rather depressed state of mind. He's going to, suffer from some alcoholism during this time. So Pierce is going to be mostly a mainline Democrat. He's going to be for low tariffs. He's going to be against the bank. He had been a hawk on Mexico, and he was against internal improvements. But as president, he kind of moderated a little on the internal improvements. He supported railroad interests as the idea of the transcontinental railroad started to, gain more and more traction. The big issue during this time is going to be the organizing of Kansas and Nebraska, and something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to apply popular sovereignty to those promising would-be states. And it's going to tear particularly Kansas apart. Kansas is also going to be referred to as bleeding Kansas during this period. And Kansas is going to be something of a microcosm for the rest of the country, as conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people is going to continue to become more and more divisive during this time. So the Republican Party is going to form during this time, and they're going to be a decidedly northern party. Now, the Whigs had probably more support in the North than they did in the South, but as we looked at those earlier electoral maps, we saw that the Whigs were able to win their fair share of southern states. They weren't a exclusively northern party, but the Republicans will be, at least during this period, an exclusively northern party. So they're going to be against the Compromise of 1850 and for Kansas and Nebraska being unequivocal free states. So otherwise, they're going to support a lot of those Whig causes that we've been talking about earlier, like a higher tariff, internal improvements. And so the Republican Party is also going to be the party of industrialization, commerce, and the business class. And they're going to be continue to be the party of the business class and of the commercial interests really up until very recently. So let's look at some prominent members of the early Republican Party here in this slide. Now, one person who's not pictured here is Millard Fillmore. Now, in the 1856 election, Fillmore will be a candidate, but not of the Republican Party. He's going to be a candidate of the American Party. Now, remember, the Whigs had been kind of a leaning anti-immigrant party, and Fillmore came from that faction that was more for restrictions on immigration. He's going to continue to hold those positions as immigration is going to increase more and more. And generally, the Republicans are going to be more for restrictions on immigration than the Democrats, but the American Party even more so. And the American Party is going to be more moderate on these questions of slavery, so it's going to fit Fillmore rather well. But the person that's going to get nominated by the Republicans is going to be John Freeman, pictured here. And he had been a military man and a territory governor, so he had helped to organize California, and he was very anti-slavery during this period. But he's going to lose to Democrat James Buchanan. So other prominent early Republicans will be Salmon P. Chase, another guy that was very anti-slavery. So he had been a member of the Whig Party, but in its sort of waning days, he switched and joined the Free Soil Party, and now that the Republican Party formed, he joined it. William Seward, who we talked about earlier, who had been a prominent Whig politician, is going to be a member of this new Republican Party. So not going to be too much of a jump for him because he's going to support a lot of the Republican ideas. He had been very much for the idea of Kansas being a free state and was very prominent in that fight. So the Republicans welcomed him with open arms. And of course, we're going to see Abraham Lincoln, a politician from Illinois. He's had been in the House of Representatives. He had voted against the Mexican War, and he had run for Senate against the aforementioned Stephen Douglas, who had been a kind of moderate from Illinois. Stephen Douglas is going to beat Lincoln in the 1858 Senate election, but Lincoln's prominence is going to rise, and he's going to end up being the Republican nominee in the 1860 election. And the other person pictured here is Charles Sumner, another very vocal anti-slavery, outspoken politician there. So he is going to be an abolitionist that's going to be a member of this new Republican Party. 1860 election is certainly going to be a pivotal moment in history. We're going to see the Democratic Party split in two during this period. We're going to basically see a Northern Democratic nominee and a Southern Democratic nominee. So the Southern Democratic nominee will be John Breckinridge, who's going to be more unabashedly pro-slavery. Now, the Northern Democratic nominee is going to be Stephen Douglas, who really wasn't anti-slavery. He was more of the proponent of popular sovereignty, more of the proponent of compromise. But the Southern Democrats are not going to be about compromise. They're going to be for more of a steadfast pro-Southern position, whereas Douglas is going to try to take this middle ground, but he's not going to win many states with that middle ground. So there's going to be another candidate named John Bell from the Constitutional Union Party, and he's going to be the guy that's pretty much going to get the support of what's left of the Whigs from these middle states and southern states. So they had been dwindling in the last few elections, but there still were some supporters there. So you're going to see John Bell win some middle states like Kentucky, which had been Henry Clay's old stomping ground. And we saw the Whigs had actually done pretty well in some of those elections in the past. So John Bell is going to win some of those states there. So but you're going to see Abraham Lincoln end up winning the 1860 election, and he's going to get the electoral college majority, but only a plurality of the popular vote. And you're going to see there Lincoln only winning the northern states and those two western states. When civil war breaks out, many northern Democrats will be dovish, including many from those urban political machines that I spoke of earlier, and many in the immigrant community will also be rather dovish as it relates to the Civil War. Also, many border counties that had a lot of Democrats, they will also be dovish. So we're looking at the southern parts of states like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. We're going to be, thinking about some of the states like Kentucky, which had been a slave state but did not join the Confederacy, Maryland, Delaware, same thing. So there's going to be some dovish Democrats in those states that if they're either going to be sympathetic to the South in some cases, or they're just going to be for not really engaging in war and conflict, looking to have compromise with the South. So one of Lincoln's early generals is going to be General McClellan, but he's going to be criticized for being too passive in his strategy, and Lincoln is going to end up firing him. And then McClellan is going to end up being the Democratic nominee for president in 1864. So, with a lot of Democrats supporting these dovish positions, they're going to pick this dovish general as their nominee. So there would be a period during the war where the popularity of the war in the North was rather tepid, but it's going to, as the war goes on, the North is going to start to get more and more successful, and the popularity of the war will increase. And by the time the 1864 election happens, the war will be going very positively for the North, and that's going to help Lincoln to defeat McClellan in that election. So they do hold an election right in the middle of the Civil War, which might surprise a lot of people. But America, there's been elections every 4 years, and the Civil War was no exception. So the North is going to win the war, and the effort to put the South back together again after the war is going to be referred to as Reconstruction. So slavery is going to get abolished, and blacks are going to get the right to vote. The Republicans will be divided between those that want to be more heavy-handed in their dealing with the former Confederate states in the South, centrally controlling things and limiting those southern states' ability to self-govern. But there's going to be another faction of Republicans that's going to be a little bit less draconian in their approach towards Reconstruction, a little bit more moderate. So we're going to have this faction called the sort of radical Republicans, and then another faction that we might call the moderate Republicans. So as far as the southern states go, at first in the early part of Reconstruction, there's actually going to be Republicans are going to be pretty strong there, as they're going to the military is going to pretty much control things. Some Northerners are going to move to the South called carpetbaggers. So we're going to actually see Republicans do well for a short period of time in the South. But that's only going to go for so long, and then the Democrats are going to reemerge and sort of be the party of the South for several generations thereafter. So after Lincoln is assassinated, his vice president is going to take over, and his name is Andrew Johnson. But Johnson's going to alienate a lot of those radical Republicans, and they're going to end up impeaching him, but not being able to remove him from office. They come close, but he stays in office. Failing the Senate vote is going to fail by one vote to remove him. But after Johnson leaves, the next president is going to be Ulysses Grant, who had been a general during the Civil War, and he's going to become president after the 1868 election. So he's only going to have weak Democratic opposition because in 1868, and frankly, still in 1872, the Democrats are going to be pretty weak. But after that, they're going to start to claw back, the Democrats will. And one of the things that's going to help the Democrats as they start to claw back in the 1870s is going to be the Ku Klux Klan, which is going to be an organization that's very much going to be in favor of the Democratic Party, trying to suppress the votes of those that might vote Republican, including a lot of black voters. So the Ku Klux Klan is going to be engaging in an assortment of different activities to intimidate blacks and to try to keep them from voting, and thus helping the Democrats regain control of the South. So Democrats are also going to start to reestablish their support in the North, winning over many industrial workers, because as this post-Civil War period occurs, we're going to see the industrial sector start to grow more and more. Cities are going to start to grow more and more, and Democrats are going to certainly be helped by that in certain cases. So there's going to be a scandal involving Grant's cabinet in 1873. So all these things put together, the growing immigration, growing urbanization, the Ku Klux Klan. So we're going to have a very competitive election in 1876. We're going to see New York's Governor Samuel Tilden run as the Democratic candidate. While he is from New York, he's going to be from an anti-Tammany faction in the New York Democratic Party, and the Republicans are going to nominate Rutherford B. Hayes, a governor of Ohio. And this result will be very close and very contentious indeed. The election is going to go towards the House of Reps. Several states are going to be too close to call and disputed. So a deal is going to have to be made on who's going to be the next president. And basically, the summary of that deal is that Hayes will end up being elected. Some southern states that maybe didn't really care for Hayes that much are going to hold their nose and support him if he agrees to end Reconstruction. So it's going to pretty much mark the end of Reconstruction and the results of this 1876 election.
The next phase of history is sometimes referred to as the Industrial Revolution or the Gilded Age. It is marked by a large growth in cities, more manufacturing, and more immigration, more wealth being created. The wealthy class during this period is often referred to as robber barons, and they would generally be associated with the Republican Party, which is still going to be the party of business and commerce during this period. So let's break down who was supporting whom as far as the different parties go during this Gilded Age. So the Democrats are going to have solid support in the South. The Republicans are not going to be particularly active across the South. And the Democrats are also going to have the support of many of the prairie states, the prairie populist movement. They're still going to be largely the party of small farmers during this time, but they're also going to be the party of manufacturing and mine workers. Mines are going to start to grow more and more, especially in states like Nevada. So the Democrats are going to basically be the working class party during this time and the party of immigrants, particularly in the northeastern cities. Now, where the Republicans are going to get their support, a lot of the Union veterans are going to support the Republicans, and there's going to be a lot of Union veterans during this period. So they're going to be a pretty important faction. There's also going to be immigrants that are going to move specifically to the rural Midwest. So we see a lot of Germans and Scandinavians moving to places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and a lot of them are actually going to be Republicans. So they're going to buck the trend of immigrants generally being Democrat. That particular group of immigrants is going to be more Republicans. So the industrialists, the sort of robber barons themselves, a lot of them are going to be Republicans, but also the middle managers and the professional classes, the small businessmen, the entrepreneurs, they're going to be largely supporting the Republican Party during this time, as will a lot of the religious people during this time, and a lot of the reformers are also going to be an important faction within the Republican Party. So let's talk about some of the issues that are going to be important during this Gilded Age. And monetary policy is going to dominate for a significant period of this Gilded Age. And Democrats are going to tend to favor a looser monetary policy, a policy that's more geared towards inflation and less on deflation. So with a lot of wealth being created, the question is going to be, where does the money come from? What is the money going to be based on? The tight monetary policy is going to be the gold standard, and more of the Republicans are going to favor that gold standard. Now, the Democrats are going to favor a looser monetary policy, often a policy where gold and silver being more plentiful, is going to be what the money is going to be backed by. And by backing it on two different metals, it's going to allow for more money to be in circulation, which could lead to inflation, which was actually good for a lot of the debtors that supported the Democratic Party, but not good for a lot of the investment class and a lot of the lenders that supported the Republican Party. So we still have the tariff issue, and the Democrats are going to be for the low tariffs. Republicans are going to be for the higher tariffs. And Democrats are going to start to favor more and more regulations on businesses during this time, whereas Republicans are going to be against that. Republicans are going to favor the railroad industries during this time as they're going to become more and more powerful. And like I said, the Republicans are going to support business in general. Republicans are going to tend to favor tighter immigration laws, whereas Democrats are going to favor looser immigration laws. And especially as we get towards the latter part of this period, Republicans are going to start to support more and more hawkish foreign policy and more imperialism. So let's look at some prominent Democratic politicians during this time. Let's start with Honest John Kelly here. He's going to lead Tammany Hall during this period. He's going to advocate for immigrants, particularly Irish Catholics, which had been growing more and more in numbers since the potato famine. And we're going to get to this point in the Gilded Age where those numbers are really going to be high indeed of numbers of Irish Catholics in America. So he's going to bump heads with Samuel Tilden, and Tilden's going to be more of a reformer, whereas Kelly is going to be more of a sort of machine politician, shall we say. Now, David Hill is going to be a New York politician that's going to be a lot allied with Kelly. So, I'd say Hill and Kelly are going to represent the machine, whereas the likes of Samuel Tilden is going to be against that machine. So we're going to see both of them bump heads with Grover Cleveland, who's pictured on the top right here. Cleveland is going to become the 22nd and 24th president, so the first president to serve non-consecutive terms. And he's going to support many Democratic policies, a lot of what I talked about before as far as low government spending, as far as low tariffs. But what he is going to differ from mainline Democrats on is he is going to be for more hard currency and not for some of this soft currency that some of the other Democrats are going to favor. So he's going to bump heads with some of the some of the soft currency favored Democrats that otherwise are going to be here. So otherwise, we're going to see Hill create Adirondack Park during this time, which is a major sort of event in New York history. So he is going to be an advocate of Tammany Hall, whereas Grover Cleveland, who is from the Buffalo area, is going to be an opponent of Tammany Hall during this time. Now, during Cleveland's presidency, there's going to be a big economic downturn, and that downturn is going to, be centered around 1893, and that's going to, cause Cleveland a lot of headaches during his second term as the 24th president. We're also seeing pictured here Adlai Stevenson. He is from Illinois, and he's going to be an advocate for immigrants, and he's going to have the support of a lot of the German American population in Illinois. So Stevenson is going to favor softer money, and he's going to be the running mate of both Cleveland and Williams Jennings Bryan, who's pictured bottom right there. So Stevenson's grandson, also named Adlai Stevenson, will become a prominent Democrat in a later era, and maybe we'll get to him in part two. But first, I want to talk about William Jennings Bryan. He is going to be a prairie populist, and he's going to be a big advocate of small farmers. And he's definitely going to be a big advocate of the silver issue and for soft currency. So he does not like the gold standard. He wants to move into a policy where there's more softer money. So the conflict with Spain is going to become a bigger and bigger issue during this time. And William Jennings Bryan is going to have a relatively dovish policy towards the Philippines. So he's going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party 3 times, but unable to win the presidency any of those times.
So let's look at some prominent Gilded Age Republicans, starting with Benjamin Harrison. He'll be the 23rd president. So he's going to be president in between Grover Cleveland's 2 terms, and he's also the grandson of William Henry Harrison. So as I mentioned before, Benjamin Harrison had a pretty standard traditional Whig slash Republican set of policies. He was for the tariff, he was for internal improvements, and he certainly favored commerce and industry during his presidency and during his political career in general, as did James Blaine, pictured to the right of him. James Blaine came from Maine, and he was a leading congressional figure. He also ran for president but he was not never elected president. And James Blaine was also something of an advocate for Civil War veterans. Now, at the time, Civil War veterans supported the Republican Party much more strongly than they did the Democrat Party, and that was a big part of their constituency. So pensions for Civil War veterans was something that James Blaine really fought for during his career. And to the right of him, we see Roscoe Conkling. He was something of a machine politician in his own right. So it wasn't just the Democrats who were engaging in patronage and the sort of machine type politics. So basically, he led the more upscale version of machine politics. Unlike Tammany Hall, where a lot of its members were poor, more immigrants, the Republican version of that, led by Roscoe Conkling, was more of an upscale thing. But so he definitely, was a very powerful figure in the state of New York as he led that operation. And to the right of him would be William McKinley, the 25th president, and he's going to be president during the Spanish American War. So thought of as something of an imperialist president. He saw territory expand as a result, partly of that war. We're going to see Puerto Rico added as a U.S. territory. We're going to see Guam added as a U.S. territory. For a brief period, the Philippines is going to be a U.S. territory, and also Hawaii is going to become a U.S. territory during the presidency of William McKinley. Below that is a statue that was erected of William McKinley in a village called Walden, New York. Now, I remember seeing this and it kind of struck me as, you don't see a lot of William McKinley statues around, but I saw one there in Walden and later looked it up and kind of saw what was behind that. But Walden was a manufacturing village. It was, kind of one of those company towns, and there were a few knife manufacturing facilities in Walden that were rather large and they employed a lot of people. But during this time, the German knife manufacturers were kind of flooding the American market with their knives, and William McKinley supported a tariff on those foreign knife products. So it ended up, kind of helping the local industry there in Walden. Probably saved a lot of jobs, so they would erect a statue for him there. Unfortunately, William McKinley will end up being assassinated by an anarchist, so he's not going to complete his second term. So that's really going to conclude our look at the political parties as we're now going to get into the 20th century in part two of this video. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I would appreciate if you do like this video, to hit the like button. But otherwise, I hope to see you next time as we look at part two of the history of American political parties.